Hi everyone, Petrik here. For today's video, it will be something that I've always wanted to do. I've always wanted to cover about this on my channel. It is self-published fantasy versus traditionally published fantasy books and which one is actually better. So this video is chosen by my patrons on my Patreon as my video of the month to do on this channel. So usually every month I ask my patrons which topic or content should I do on my booktube channel, and for this month this one is chosen. Well, I've always wanted to do this anyway, so this is the right push for me. Self-published fantasy is almost always, in the eyes of the majority of readers, at a disadvantage when it compares to traditionally published fantasy books. This, from my perspective and from asking a lot of self-published fantasy authors, has gotten better throughout the years. Back when I first started reading self-published fantasy books, I think it was in 2017, so 4 years ago. Back then, the stigma against self-published fantasy books, it was so much worse than it is today. As I said, this has gotten so much better throughout the years, and I think today self-published fantasy has been regarded so much more highly than it is before. But this doesn't mean that the stigma against self-published fantasy books are gone. It's not the case. It's still there. It's just, well, things just got better already. But it doesn't mean that it's gone. And most of the time, this stigma consists of 6 ideas. I will be covering each idea and then give my overall thoughts on them. Hopefully, if you're watching this for the first time and you have a stigma against self-published fantasy, I'm not judging you. I have been there myself. But I'm hoping that this video can sway you, because there are so many amazing stories and amazing books in self-published fantasy, and you are missing out if you let your stigma guide your path. And the first one that I want to discuss is cover art. But before that, speaking of cover art, today's video is sponsored by Skillshare. As always, I'm glad to be collaborating with Skillshare again. For the uninitiated, Skillshare is an online learning community. There is a lot of classes on Skillshare, like thousands of classes on topics such as illustration, graphic design, book design, photography, animation, music production, video making, and more. Today, I want to give a recommendation to another class I took, and it's Introduction to Book Cover Design, Making Stories Visual by ChipKit. In my previous sponsored video with Skillshare, I recommended a class about cover art. Today, it will be about book cover design. This is a great class that tells the entire process of a cover design, from research, typography, inspiration, series design, and managing and preparing for rejection. This class has it all. This class will be helpful for anyone who wants to learn more about an example of how the cover design of a book is made. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And to get back on the matter of cover art in self-published versus traditionally published fantasy, often when it comes to self-published fantasy books, when people hear about self-published fantasy, they often think that self-published fantasy books have inferior cover arts. This is simply not true. This is not true. Maybe it is back then. I'm not sure about this. Again, as I said, I've started reading self-published fantasy only since 2017, and maybe things are indeed worse back then. But from my experience, this is not the case. I have so many self-published fantasy books that I add to my TBR pile only because they have gorgeous cover art. And you know what? Traditionally published fantasy doesn't mean that it immediately have gorgeous cover art. I have seen a lot of traditionally published fantasy books with a cover art that, in my opinion, made me really wonder how they got used in the first place. They are so ugly. And if you have been watching my channel, you know that I will be talking about this book again. It is Heroes Die by Matthew Woodring Stover. It's one of the worst cover art that I've ever seen, and the cover art have pushed me away from reading this book for years. And I'm glad that I finally got to read it because it is amazing. This cover art doesn't capture anything about the book at all. It is bad, and this is not the only case when it comes to traditionally published fantasy. So just because a novel is self-published, it doesn't mean that it immediately will have a bad cover art. And of course, my experience is only for self-published fantasy books. I don't know about any other genre for this. But when it comes to fantasy, lately a lot of self-published fantasy authors are hiring and commissioning a lot of expensive artists, a lot of expensive and incredible artists to do their cover art. For example, there is Felix Ortiz, there is John Anthony Di Giovanni. Both of them are so prominent in self-published fantasy books. And Felix Ortiz and John Anthony Di Giovanni are just the tip of the iceberg. Rachel Aaron, the author behind the Heartstriker series, have also hired Louisa Presser to do her cover art. Then there is Dominic Darrow, who did the cover art to Dreams of the Dying by Nicholas Litzau. And I also know that some self-published fantasy authors have hired Chris McGrath to do their cover art. Chris McGrath is an amazing cover artist, and he's not cheap to commission. I'm pretty sure at least at $3,000 for a cover art. That's just for one cover art. Seriously, I know so many self-published fantasy books with such amazing cover art, and the idea that self-published fantasy books doesn't have a good cover art is a ridiculous idea in my opinion. And then my second point is on the matter of editing. It's still crazy that to this day, I still see reviews for highly praised fantasy books, self-published fantasy books, and in the reviews it stated that this book needs more editing. You know what? Just because a book doesn't click with you doesn't mean that the book needs more editing. Because believe me, if the book doesn't click for you already, it's quite likely that another editing done for the book won't change your mind on that. And of course, this doesn't go for all self-published fantasy books. There are indeed quite a lot of circumstances where a self-published fantasy doesn't have any editing done towards it yet, but I think that's very noticeable. And when that happens, I think a lot of the reviews will point that out. But if a highly praised self-published fantasy books get a review like I just said earlier, then that's another case. It probably means that the book doesn't click for you. And the next 2 points that I want to mention is definitely related to the matter of editing, and the first one is typo. Self-published fantasy is at a huge disadvantage when it comes to typo. Let's just say that a self-published fantasy books have 1 or 2 typo. A reviewer might point that out if it's a self-published fantasy books. They will say something like, maybe not too offensive, maybe something like, for a self-published fantasy books, this book only have 1 or 2 typo. On a glance, that sounds positive, but it's not. So what if it's a traditionally published fantasy books? Does that mean that 1 or 2 typo is okay? And more importantly, will that be pointed out? Because I have seen a lot of traditionally published fantasy books with a lot of typos, but that's never get pointed out. But a self-published fantasy books, a highly praised one with 1 or 2 typos immediately get pointed out. This is a similar case with me having English as my third language. Why is it that I, who use English as my third language, sometimes when I make a grammatical error, I get corrected? But I have seen a lot of reviewers who use English as their first language made a grammatical error, but they never get corrected. So why is it that I, who use English as my third language, get corrected, but they, who use English as their first language, doesn't get corrected? Shouldn't they be the one that get corrected, not me? If that's the case, or maybe just correct them all. I personally don't care about typos. I think authors or reviewers, we are all only humans, and well, you know, typos are like magic. They can always slip by somehow. So the idea that self-published fantasy books, when they have typo, immediately means that it's normal for self-published fantasy books, well, that is a damaging idea, and I really don't agree with that. And then on the matter of editing, there is a matter of formatting. This is the one thing that almost always drives me nuts when I'm reading an e-arc for a traditionally published fantasy books. Look, I'm really grateful. I'm always grateful that I get the opportunity to read an e-arc or a physical arc. All of them means a lot to me. But self-published fantasy authors doesn't have any room for a bad formatting in their e-arc or their books. Basically all of their books. They have to be perfectly formatted. And just to make my points clear and easier to digest, I will now show you an e-arc of a traditionally published fantasy. Look at this. Yeah, look at this. This is a real page of an e-arc. Now imagine if this is done in self-published fantasy. I am pretty sure that readers will not forgive self-published fantasy authors who have this kind of page on their e-arc or their books. But when it comes to traditionally published fantasy, they're okay. So as I said in the beginning of this video, self-published fantasy is always at a disadvantage. And now let's move on to the next point, and it is the matter of quality, which is quite likely the most important part of a book. I want to make myself clear first. Even though in this video I have been defending self-published fantasy a lot, I actually read more traditionally published fantasy books, so much more than self-published fantasy. I've read probably about 100 self-published fantasy books, and I've read about 400 traditionally published fantasy books. So yeah, that's a lot of differences. Even though I read quite a lot of self-published fantasy books, I still need to read a lot more. But when it comes to the matter of quality, I think none of them are actually better than each other. Both traditionally published fantasy or self-published fantasy books, both of them have amazing stories. But I will say one thing though, that self-published fantasy often excels lately, and it is their hardcover. There has been a surge of so gorgeous self-published fantasy hardcover. I have shown plenty of them on this channel, such as Dreams of the Dying, such as Dragon Mage, and then there's also Spirit of Vengeance, and there's more. There is so many more now. in comparison, a lot of mainstream hardcover in traditionally published fantasy market, well, they're just lacking in comparison to the self-published fantasy hardcovers. Unless, of course, we're speaking about special edition and illustrated edition, then that's a different matter. But the self-published fantasy hardcovers I'm talking about, they are mainstream and they all look like they're illustrated edition of the traditionally published fantasy books. It's insane, and it's a huge incentive to get a self-published fantasy in a hardcover format. However, this indeed leads to the next point, and it is pricing. So I have heard a lot of people say that self-published fantasy books, their physical books, are expensive. And this one, I will not disagree with you. It is true. It is true. So for self-published fantasy books, especially their hardcover format, they can be super pricey. They are more often than not more expensive than traditionally published fantasy books. For example, Dreams of the Dying and Dragon Mage. I'm just going to use these two as an example because they are gorgeous, okay? And I love these two books. Both of them, the hardcover, are priced at $48. That is super pricey. And it's understandable because, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of self-published fantasy books, their price are judged by the number of pages they have. It's unfortunate, but that's the situation. So when it comes to the matter of pricing, traditionally published fantasy books, at least from where I live, and I'm speaking only for the physical format, they are indeed so much more cheaper to get, even though they're already expensive from where I live. But how about the ebooks? Well, this is the benefit of self-published fantasy books. If you don't mind reading ebooks, if you don't mind reading from your Kindle, a lot of self-published fantasy books are included in Kindle Unlimited. So what does this mean? I'm not sponsored by Amazon, by the way, and I'm not sponsored by Kindle Unlimited, but this is such a huge benefit, especially if you're a voracious reader. So if you subscribe to Kindle Unlimited, every book included in the program, there are a lot of books included in the program. You can read any one of them. You can borrow and read any one of them as long that you subscribe to Kindle Unlimited. Yes, some traditionally published fantasy books are indeed available in this program, but the majority are self-published fantasy books. Seriously, Sword of Kaigen, every book by Rob J. Hayes, every book in the Cradle series, all of them are available in Kindle Unlimited. So when you subscribe to Kindle Unlimited, you can actually read all of this, any one of them, and the authors do get paid for it. So it's a win-win situation. And yeah, unless I get sent physical books by authors, I usually read self-published fantasy books through an ebook format, usually through Kindle Unlimited. And lastly, it is on the topic that self-published fantasy authors are less successful than traditionally published fantasy authors. That is just not true. Seriously, if you know the number of money that some self-published fantasy authors are making monthly, you will be utterly shocked. Some of them are actually making more than traditionally published fantasy authors make in their advance. And there is a great example for a super successful self-published fantasy author already, and it is Will White, the author behind the Cradle series. As I constantly said on my channel, Will White, every book in the Cradle series since I think Underlord or Uncrowned, which is the 6th or 7th book of the series, have been reaching the #1 spot on the entire Amazon store every time they get released. So recently, Reaper was just released, and again, it was at the #1 spot. Or the #2 spot, I think there was Dune. I think there was Dune in the #1 spot, but I could be mistaken on this. But I'm pretty sure for Wintersteel, the 8th book, and also Bloodline, the 9th book, they did succeed in reaching the #1 spot on the entire Amazon store. That's how popular and how successful Cradle is, a self-published fantasy series by a self-published fantasy author. And of course, there will be an argument that says, well, Will White is special, but this applies only to Will White, but that's not the case. I assure you, that is not the case. There is a lot of self-published fantasy authors making a huge amount of money. Maybe their books in physical format doesn't appear a lot on bookstores, but I assure you, some of them are making a lot of money. And of course, this doesn't mean that self-published fantasy authors immediately means they're more successful than traditionally published fantasy authors. That is not the case. Again, a lot of authors are struggling. Please do not think that once they become an author, they're immediately rich. That is simply not true, and that's a misconception that should be killed immediately. So at the end of the day, my overall thought on traditionally published fantasy versus self-published fantasy books is, well, none of them are better. Both of them are equally amazing to me, and I'm glad that I have the opportunity to read both traditionally published and self-published fantasy books. I have so many options for so many amazing stories, and I'm always thankful for that. Seriously, the majority of the time, self-published fantasy and traditionally published fantasy are only divided by business decision, because self-published fantasy means they have to do everything by themselves, including editing, including hiring cover artists, everything they have to do it themselves. And that means a lot of money will be spent before their book gets out in the market. And in a lot of cases, it might take a while before their money gets returned. As for traditionally published fantasy, they have a team behind them, so they don't have to spend more money on cover art and editing. But the sales of their books still have to meet the amount of advance they get before they could get more money from the sales of their books. So there is more detailed information on this topic. I will link the article down in the description. So yeah, that's pretty much it for me today. If you're watching this, I'm really hoping that you will give more chances to self-published fantasy books, because seriously, there are a lot of amazing series, a lot of amazing books in self-published fantasy. And this, of course, doesn't mean that you should just stop reading traditionally published fantasy books. That's not the case. As I said, I love both traditionally published fantasy and self-published fantasy. Read both if you can. Seriously, enrich your reading experience. So yeah, that's pretty much it for me today. As always, thank you so much for watching, and thank you for your support. Bye bye.